am very proud to welcome you to our third annual Visiting Ethicist Lecture, and I'm particularly excited about this lecture, as I am, I guess, about all of them, but I will be introducing our speaker and explain to you my level of excitement. My name is Claudia McCullough. I am director of the Jackson Family Center for Ethics and Values here at Coastal. We sponsor visiting ethicists, one visiting ethicist a year, and we find this to be an exciting and pinnacle event for our center. I have a few little housekeeping things to do before we get started. My first is, please, my dear friends, cell phones are off, and also text messaging is off in this environment. Also, I find it hard to accept that people might have to leave early, so we won't do that in this arena. Thank you. I want to do a couple of things before we get started, and one of those things is I want to recognize the board members of the Jackson Center. These ladies and gentlemen give a lot of their time and energy to our center, and it occurred to me a while ago, I've never introduced them publicly. So if you are a board member, if you would please stand and let us give you a round of applause. Thank you. I can assure you, without this board, we wouldn't be here at all. I'm sad to tell you that both Nelson and Mary Emily Jackson, for whom the center is named, are ill. Each of them is ill and will not be able to attend today. But we have their daughters in the audience and on our board. So we're here in spirit and for sure. Another thing I want to tell you is that we also have in the audience today our Jackson Scholars. The Jackson Scholars are a group of students selected after a very long and arduous process just because they are young people that we know will go on and lead an ethical and meaningful life, and they do a lot of work and they take a lot of courses, and they're all standing in the back, and so I want you to wave or something, my friends. So I give them some applause. I'm glad you're not a Jackson Scholar right now because I work them hard. You will also see my assistant director sitting there in the very middle, Billy Baird. This is his very last public event. Billy will move on to graduate school. Okay. One more little housekeeping thing. In the lobby, we have Joanne Ciulla's book, Ethics, the Heart of Leadership, for sale. And I just spoke with Dr. Ciulla, and she tells me that she will be delighted to sign a few for you. So that'll be nice. So if you purchase a book and we're out in the lobby, Dr. Ciulla will sign it. Another thing she asked me to tell you is her very favorite part of teaching is the question and answer period, the Socratic dialogue. So we're going to have good questions and answers, and she likes that. So we will have a question and answer period at the end. I've already told the student who has a class that she may leave during that period so that she will not be late to class. So it is acceptable to do that if you have a class. What can I say about Dr. Ciulla? I can't give you her whole curriculum vitae because guess what? It's 27 pages long. And about 25 of those pages are writings and presentations. She is one amazing scholar and person. So what we did with our program was to give you a synopsis of her vita on the bottom of the program. I will tell you of note, Dr. Ciulla has been a scholar in such institutions as the Ford School of Business and Harvard University. In some instances, she was the first woman in some of these arenas, so I'm really proud and excited to have her here. I also want you to know that Dr. Ciulla's work is studied here at Coastal. My students went through a case she wrote called The Oil Rig, And we batted that out. If you were a student of mine, you remember those days. Here's the lady responsible for it. So she's very well known in ethics circles and in leadership circles and in business ethics circles. And I also want to tell you, I spent the day with her and we just had a wonderful time. So I am very excited and very honored to present to you Dr. Joanne Ciulla.
Thank you. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm absolutely delighted to learn about the Jackson Center. Before I get started, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I got into leadership and ethics, because actually there's surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, there's very few people who work in this area, specifically in academia. And so I thought I'd step back and talk a little about how I got into it, and also why I think a center of applied ethics and philosophic ethics is absolutely exciting, and on this campus or anywhere. When I started teaching in 1975, I was in a philosophy department, and nobody wanted to take any of our courses. We had, a lot of my colleagues were Thomists, meaning they specialized in St. Thomas Aquinas, and for some reason the undergraduates just weren't interested in those courses. Why? You know, because Aquinas talks about angels dancing on heads of pins and other things, and we thought that would be a great course, but nobody took our courses, and we had this faculty meeting that was an absolutely pivotal point in my life as a scholar. And at this faculty meeting, we kind of fumbled around about, well, what courses do students like to take in philosophy? And we discovered there were two courses that they liked out of all of our offerings. One was a course called The Philosophy of Death and Dying. The other was a course called Love and Human Sexuality. Now, I was at a Catholic school, and the fellow who taught that course had 11 children. So we thought he was really qualified for the course. So here we were. We had sex and we had death. And the question was, what do you do in between sex and death? I'm Italian. I thought eating would be a good topic, but it's hard to have a philosophy of eating course. So we ended up with a course called the Philosophy of Work. And I began teaching that course and looking at the ethical issues related to work and people at work. And work, of course, is so much a part of our lives. It gives our lives meaning. It makes us feel useful, that it really allowed one to think about a lot of philosophic issues. And then when I taught the course, this is where I got really sold on applied ethics. I used to teach in the evening, and I had people who would come from work to this class. And there was one woman who would come in every class. She would sit in the back. And these are people, I had policemen, I had nurses, I had all sorts of people in the audience. And she would sit in the back, and every night she would, as soon as I'd start talking, she'd fall asleep. And the woman looked exhausted, so I didn't do anything to wake her up. I just let her sleep. And then one day I was talking about Karl Marx, and I was explaining one of his theories about surplus labor value, which is the idea that when you go to work, you get paid a certain wage, but you create more value than your actual wage. So I said, imagine you work in a department store and you're selling coats. She can't turn it off. Oh my, it won't stop. So I said, imagine you're in a department store and you're selling coats, and in 1 hour you sell 10 coats. The store makes X amount of profit, but you still make minimum wage. And all of a sudden, this woman in the back woke up, and her hand shot up in the air, and she said, you know, that's right. And it was an amazing moment for me as a philosopher, because I realized that woman's reaction explained a large portion of the 20th century. It explained why some people thought communism was a good idea. We all know it wasn't a particularly good idea, but there was a moral element to communism about people getting fair wages, etc., that really resonated. And after that, I thought, you know, philosophy is really something for people. It's something that should be taken out like Socrates did, taken out on the street, walked around, talked about in communities. It should be the most fun thing people do. At least I think it's the most fun thing. And everything I've heard about the Jackson Center, it sounds like you're doing your best to take it out to the community. I hear people talk ethics and drink tea. They drink coffee. She didn't tell me what else they drink, but it sounds like you really made it come alive, and that makes me very excited. Okay, so Let's see how brave you are. Let me start with a quote from Immanuel Kant. And if you don't run out of here screaming, I'll know it's a good audience. Immanuel Kant made this interesting observation about people. He said, "From such warped wood as is man-made, that nothing straight can be fashioned." It's a rather powerful notion. Another philosopher called this the crooked timber of humanity. That people aren't perfect, as we all well know. And this is a profound idea when you think about leadership, because very often we expect our leaders to be close to perfect. And we also know that when our leaders aren't perfect, it makes a very, very big difference. That's why I use this term, that leadership is morality magnified. When leaders do good things, they magnify and do very good things for a lot of people. When they do bad things, even if they're small bad things, the ramifications can be huge. And that's one of the ways in which leaders are somewhat morally different than other people. Now, some people argue leaders should be held to a higher moral standard. They usually bang their fist on something when they say it. Higher moral standard. If you think about it, that sentence doesn't make much sense, because if leaders should be held to a higher moral standard, would that mean that everyone else can be held to a lower moral standard? Well, that doesn't quite work. So what we mean when we say leaders should be held to a higher moral standard is, first of all, they should be held to the same standard as everyone else. And what we hope for are leaders who don't fail at living up to that same standard. Now, throughout history, people have talked about leaders. And I think one of the most fascinating things about ethics, and to a great extent leadership, is that it is not like science or technology. There is not, unfortunately, a linear progression of progress in either of them. Some of the best literature on ethics and leadership is ancient literature, which is surprising. When I first came into this field in 1991, what was really depressing was I did enormous literature searches and came up with very, very few articles, scholarly articles, that looked at the ethics of leadership. I went to the ancient literature and found quite a bit of material on it. Our own Benjamin Franklin had his own idea of what leaders needed. He talked about the virtues of them. Leaders, according to Benjamin Franklin, needed to have the virtues of temperance, silence, maybe some of our leaders could use that, order, resolution, sincerity, justice, moderation, here's a good one, cleanliness. Remember Senator Biden's mistake when he said what he said about Barack Obama? He said he was articulate and clean. Maybe he was thinking of Ben Franklin. Tranquility is another quality. Chastity. We never talk much about that, but we know they get in trouble for that. And humility. He said these are all the qualities that leaders need to have to be successful. So he had a decent idea of what was important for leaders. Now, the other interesting thing about leadership, when you look at some of the empirical material on leadership, there's a group called Transparency International. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but you should Google Transparency International. What Transparency International does is every year it does a survey of, I think this year they're up to about 164 countries. And they create something called the Corruption Perception Index. And this index basically, you've got to practice what you preach. Do as she says, not as she does. Anyway, this is a fun group. I might stay here all night. Anyway, Transparency International goes around and puts together what's called a Corruption Perception Index. And what it is it's a kind of measure of how people in their own society see the level of corruption of leaders at all different levels in society. It's absolutely fascinating. This year, the United States is number 17 on the list out of about 164. Last year, it was number 15. We've gone down 2 notches. But what's fascinating about this measurement is when you look at the list of countries, and by the way, Finland's number 1, Iceland's number 2, New Zealand's number 3, in case you're interested. Cameroon has made great progress since last year. It used to be the last, and now it's 4th from the last. Haiti is at the bottom this year. Anyway, the countries go up and down on this, but this is how people see corruption in their own societies among people who are in positions of power. It's an interesting notion because it tells us something about the world. It tells us that, first of all, a little less than half of the people in the world live in places where many of their leaders in business and politics are corrupt, or they perceive them to be corrupt. And that's a rather frightening thought. The other very powerful correlation you see in this list is between corruption and poverty. And it's extremely striking. The poorer the nation, the more corrupt they are. And there are very, very few exceptions on the list. The other really funky thing I always notice, because they give a map, is that it seems that the most ethical countries in the world are the ones closest to the poles. So you get Iceland up there and New Zealand down there, and then the middle of it, they usually do it in red for some of the corrupt ones. The whole middle of the earth is bright red. So maybe geography and temperature have something to do with corruption. Maybe it's good to be cool. Anyway, so we've got a lot of leaders in the world, people in positions in power in the world, who are made of warped wood, shall we say. And of course, the challenge of both leaders and followers is how do we create environments where leaders are ethical? And of course, followers are never completely blameless with their leaders. So followers have as much of a responsibility as leaders. I want to go first and talk about Plato. Some of the best material on ethics and leadership is found in Plato. And Plato is an interesting guy if you look at his biography, because Plato grew up in a household, an aristocratic household that had leaders in it, people involved in politics. The ancients, what's interesting about all the ancients like Plato and Aristotle, these are people who lived among leaders. So when they wrote about leaders, they weren't just philosophers thinking great thoughts about them. They're people who were actually involved in them. And there's a particular involvement that Plato had with leaders that he writes about in his later years, and sort of says that this is where he learned his own lesson about leadership, and he learned that he had gotten it wrong the first time around. Plato, for many years, went to visit Syracuse, which was a city-state on the island of Sicily. And the first time he went there, he visited a leader named Dionysus I. And Dionysus was a tyrant. He was a rogue, and he had a very corrupt court. So the first time Plato went to visit him, he went to the court and thought it would be nice to visit, and he writes that he was amazed at the level of corruption in this court of Dionysus. And he said it was corrupt all over. There was scheming, there was lying, there was all sorts of stuff going on. And worst of all, one of the funniest things he writes is he wrote, these Sicilians, they eat 2 huge meals a day, which he thought was very corrupt too. Anyway, Plato then, after his first visit to Syracuse, goes back to Athens and starts his famous academy. And he writes the Republic. And most people remember, and those of you who have taken a philosophy course, I'm sure you've read the Republic, and it's best known for the Philosopher King. But the Philosopher King is not the most interesting part on leadership in the Republic. As a matter of fact, scholars may disagree with this, but I find that a minor part of the book. The most interesting part about leadership in the Republic is in the beginning, where he makes a couple observations that help us, I think, to understand some of our own feelings about leaders. Well, first, in the Republic, he begins with this idea that leaders have to be the smartest and the most virtuous people. Leaders have to be wise, and they have to have wisdom. And we can all sort of agree with that, but we can also agree that it's not necessarily a complete picture. I know in my university, we've got a lot of really smart people who are pretty ethical, but I don't think I'd want them running anything. I'm not sure, with all due respect to the philosophy department, we'd want the philosophy department running anything. So Plato had a rather narrow view in general of what leaders should be like. What was interesting about the Republic, though, and he tells us in his later writings, is that a man named Dion, who was Dionysius' brother-in-law, read the Republic and sent a note to Plato and said, read your book, loved it. Why don't you come to Syracuse and see what you can do with Dionysius' son, Dionysius II. See if you can make him into a philosopher king. So this was the basic Sicilian offer you couldn't refuse. So off Plato goes to Syracuse. And Dionysius' son, Dionysius II, was a chip off the old block. Evidently, he wasn't too smart, and he wasn't too interested in being a philosopher king. Plato went, by the way, to talk about the engagement someone like Plato had in the world. He went because it was very important that Syracuse have a good leader, because the Carthaginians were threatening the Greek world, and if Syracuse couldn't hold off Carthage, then Athens could possibly fall. So there were really big political things at stake. Anyway, he goes back to the court, and we hear from Plutarch in one of Plutarch's essays that one of the things Plato did when he got to the court and he started being a tutor to Dionysus II was he thought that leaders needed to learn geometry. And so what Plutarch writes is you could hardly see in Plato's court because the air was so thick with chalk dust. Because, of course, if the tyrant's son has to learn geometry, everybody has to learn geometry. And they were doing it with chalk. It's a marvelous image. Anyway, all sorts of intrigues took place while Plato was there. Dionysius I died, and Plato left town rather quickly and abruptly because all sorts of trouble was brewing. He later wrote another work on leadership called the Statesman. And in the Statesman, he says something very interesting. In his early work, he takes the ancient view you find in the Bible of leaders, which is that leaders should be shepherds to their flock. And we find this in a lot of ancient texts. But Plato, in the beginning of the Statesman, says leaders aren't like shepherds to their flock. He said because shepherds are humans and sheep are sheep. So he makes the first really important, profound observation, and that is that leaders are the same as their followers, which is an extremely important point in terms of how we think about leaders. He then goes on and makes an interesting analogy. He says in the Statesman, he said, leaders aren't like shepherds to their flock. What they're really like is they're like weavers. And what leaders do is they weave together the meek and the aggressive. They weave together people who don't like each other, who don't want to work with each other. That's what the job of a leader is in the Statesman. So we get some really interesting views of how Plato's own positions change. And all of this is written about in something called Epistle 7. But in the Republic, he makes a couple other points that help us to understand something about the way we feel about leaders and their ethics. He says in the Republic an interesting thing. It's a dialogue, of course, and at one point, Thrasymachus, who's one of the protagonists in the dialogue, argues, everybody, you want to be a leader to get all the power and get all the goodies and get all the money, this sort of crass, might is right kind of view. And Plato has a very, very interesting response to this. He says, and I want to read part of this to you. He says that in a city of good men, people would fight not to be leaders. And he goes on to sort of argue that in an ethical place, ethical people would not want to be leaders. Now, this is a really depressing thought, isn't it? Ethical people would not want to be leaders if they lived in an ethical city. And then he goes on to say, well, so what do we do about that? And he says, well, we threaten them. We threaten them with punishment. And he says, we threaten them with the punishment of someone leading who is worse than they are. And it's a fascinating insight because it tells us, have you ever noticed how uncomfortable you are when someone is too eager to take over or to lead? Let me do it. That's usually the person you don't want to pick, right? I want to do it. And the insight of Plato on this, I think, is fascinating. The reason why we're uncomfortable with it is because they may not realize the moral responsibilities of leadership. That when you do, you realize leadership's not a whole lot of fun. You stay up late at night, you don't sleep well, you don't get to see your family, you're tired, it's stressful. People who are ethical leaders know it's that kind of thing. If you think of leadership as whoopee, I get all the perks and the enjoyment and the money and the prestige and everything else, and I can, give all the perks to my friends, well then it's not the same kind of endeavor. So Plato realized that if you are a moral person, that leadership is a kind of burden, and that most moral people take on that burden because they feel they can do it better than other people. And I always found this interesting. I used to think about this. Remember years ago when Colin Powell didn't want to run for president? And the more he didn't want to run, the more people wanted him to run because he seemed really attractive because he didn't want to run. It's a paradox in our democracy, isn't it? Because you have to have people who want to run to go through that horrible process, but at the same time, you're really nervous about the ones who want to run. We can't have it both ways. So Plato gives us these nice insights, and he says one other thing that I think is really important about ethics and leadership. He says that one of the things that's really important in any society is that leaders be subject to laws, because laws are what compensate for bad leaders. If you have good laws, they can sort of take the place of leaders. And in the social science literature and leadership studies, there's a lot on something called leader substitutes. And that is the idea that you need mechanisms that substitute for leaders because you can't always depend on leaders being good. So Plato gives us some very nice insights. One of the big problems we have is while historically there are wonderful works of wisdom on leadership, history itself confuses us about the ethics of leadership. In history, we look at two kinds of views of leaders. The first view comes from the author Thomas Carlyle, who wrote that leaders were born, not made. That's where that expression comes from. And Thomas Carlyle just thought Napoleon Bonaparte was the bee's knees. He thought Napoleon Bonaparte was the paradigm leader. And he said, you know, leaders like Napoleon, they come on the stage and they shape history. Now, his near contemporary Leo Tolstoy in War and Peace had a very different view. What Tolstoy said about leaders is he said, no, it doesn't work that way at all. What happens is history comes along and selects a leader. So people don't make history, history makes leaders. That tension is a tension you find in the academic study of leadership, the extent to which context shapes the leader and the extent to which traits shape the leader. So when we say leaders are born, you say, well, some people are just genetically predisposed to be leaders. The other interesting thing about history, if you talk to a historian and you say, who are the great leaders of the 20th century, you could get a very funny list. You could get a list that included Adolf Hitler and Mahatma Gandhi and others, and you'd say, well, what's wrong with this picture? How do you get Gandhi and Hitler in the same sentence in terms of great leaders? And this is one of the problems that I've probed a lot in my work. I actually call it the Hitler problem. And that is that when we talk about great leaders, and when historians talk about great leaders, they talk about people who implemented some kind of change or made some kind of change in history, had some impact. They usually talk about successful people. They talk about deeds, but they don't necessarily talk about ethics. We never hear about the general who lost all of his battles but was a wonderful human being. History books usually don't write about those people. So history creates a tension that we have throughout our society, and that is a tension that I call the tension between ethics and effectiveness. The real issue in studying leadership is not what is the definition of leadership, which is what a lot of scholars think it is. It's the question, what is good leadership? And good leadership, I want to lay out for you, is just two very simple things. It's leadership that is ethical, and it's leadership that's effective. We have, unfortunately, some leaders who are very effective but not very ethical. We have other leaders who are very ethical but not very effective. Actually, I could call that sort of the Jimmy Carter problem. I mean, Jimmy Carter was a very moral man, had a very difficult time when he was president. He's been more effective since then. Very difficult time when he was president getting certain things done. So we often miss in the historical background the importance of ethics. You look at someone like Franklin Roosevelt. If Roosevelt had been president today, I think he would have had a lot of problems with the press. I mean, having an affair with your wife's secretary in the White House is a very tacky thing to do. And he would have made Bill Clinton look like an angel. But what's interesting is history always sort of looks back and says, but yes, look at how effective Roosevelt was in certain ways, and he's always rated as one of the top presidents. So there's some interesting paradoxes in history about ethics and leadership, which lead some people, unfortunately, to say, well, what really matters is effectiveness, and if they get the job done, that makes a great leader, and the ethics part gets pushed away. There's another aspect that philosophers like to talk about when they talk about ethics, and it's called moral luck. Some leaders are morally lucky. An awful lot of leadership has to do with luck. You know, I mean, going back to Jimmy Carter. Here's Jimmy Carter, fairly moral leader, having a very difficult time getting things done. Imagine if his helicopters, when he sent helicopters in to save the hostages who were being held by the Iranians, imagine if his helicopters hadn't broken down. He might have been president again. Luck has a lot to do with what happens to leaders, and moral luck is a very specific thing. When philosophers talk about moral luck, they talk about the fact that often we do things, we take actions, sometimes they're risky actions, and we don't know how they're going to turn out. But if they turn out well, the leader looks really ethical. So if you send in, if you've got a terrorist situation where hostages are being held and you send in a strike force and they save everyone without hurting the hostages and everything's won over, you're wonderful. If you do the same thing and all sorts of people get killed, that's risky behavior, it was irresponsible, and you don't look as good morally. So luck is a part of how we think of the morality of leaders as well. Now, the other aspect of leadership that people talk about quite a bit is self-control. And what's interesting when you look at Eastern and Western philosophy and what I call the Wonder Years, and the Wonder Years run from about 600 BC to about 200 BC. You've got a bunch of really extraordinary, well, I'll go back to 800. I'll get the pre-Socratics in there. But there's a period of history where you have Lao Tzu, you got Plato, you got Socrates, you got Aristotle, you got Buddha, you got Confucius. And they're all living in this rather small period of history. And they're all saying rather interesting things about morality, about life, and also, to some extent, about leaders. Lao Tzu and Confucius were very interested in the issue of self-discipline. What's interesting about the ancient Greeks is they're interested in leadership because they're talking about it with the backdrop of democracy. And what I've noticed in looking at the history of how people talk about ethics is you find there's a whole lot of discussion about it in the periods of democracy in ancient Greece and Rome, and then it sort of sloughs off for a while, pops up again around the time of Hobbes and Machiavelli when it's not about ethics and leadership, it's about tactics, it's about leadership in competitive environments, and then we don't see a whole lot about it until we get really up until the Enlightenment. So democracy has a lot to do with discussions of ethics and leadership. In countries where there are no democratic traditions, if we look at the Asian philosophers, they're much more interested, since they're stuck with the rulers they have, they're much more interested in questions of ethics and education. How do you create leaders that have the right virtues? Lao Tzu wrote quite a bit about leaders, and he made the analogy between leaders and teachers. I love some of the things that he says. Lao Tzu realized that one of the moral challenges of leaders is, of course, egotism. And in a phrase worthy of any fortune cookie, but also quite profound, he says, "He who stands on tiptoe is not steady." He also says, "The best rulers are those whose existence is merely known by people." This idea that if you've got everything running right, you don't have to necessarily be out front. Confucius is fascinating too, because Confucius was very interested in how you get good leaders in the civil service. And in his society, in Chinese society, the pull of the family was very strong. And so, of course, when people went into civil service, they wanted to bring all their relatives along with them. As a matter of fact, there's an old Chinese proverb that says, when a man gets a job in the civil service, his wife, dogs, and even chickens fly up to heaven, which tells you something about nepotism in China. But Confucius had a couple interesting things to say. He said, if the ruler can for one day master himself and return to propriety, all under heaven will return to humanity. To practice humanity depends on oneself. And then I think this is an interesting psychological insight into leadership. He says, if a ruler sets himself right, he will be followed without his command. If he does not set himself right, even his commands will not be obeyed. So the issue of self-control, self-order is extremely important in terms of being able to be followed. Other areas, you know, we all know the old sayings about power corrupting, but the other really interesting and ethically challenging part of leadership is leaders who are successful. If you think about the scandals, whether it's in the business world or political world, what you discover is that most of the scandals that make the papers are about successful people. They're not about unsuccessful people. So success in some ways is more dangerous than power itself. And one of the best leadership case studies about the dangers of success is from the Bible, the story of David and Bathsheba. King David is a fascinating case study to look at as a leader case study. And aside from all the wonderful religious aspects of it, it's a fascinating case study. Let me tell you some of the elements. First of all, we meet David in the beginning, and he is a shepherd, right? And he gets selected to fight Goliath. And one of the interesting things is, in the selection, I read that selection passage of why David gets picked as God's leadership selection process. What's important for God in a leader? I mean, who else can we ask, right? Well, for God, it's not being a strapping military guy who can fight a giant, clearly. For God, it's having a good heart. He picks David because he has a good heart, his good spirit, his faith. So for God, ethics is more important for leadership than effectiveness. But of course, if you got God on your side, I think you get a little more effectiveness out of it. So that's kind of cheating. But let me go on with the story. What's extraordinary about this piece of literature as a text is that we start with that kind of story, and then throughout, and by the way, King David is written about quite a bit in the Quran as well, we read about this enormously successful leader. We hear about all the battles he's fought, he's done all sorts of great things, he's wealthy, he's had it really good, and he's done a great job. And then we get to this really odd story of David and Bathsheba. It's a peculiar story. Why would you build up this guy as a great leader, and then you'd have this story? Well, I want to go through the story to tell you some of the kinds of pathologies you see in that story that we see in leaders today. Here's King David, as the story tells us. His troops are fighting a battle on the front, and King David comes home, and he's in his palace. He's walking around the top of his palace, and he sees a woman bathing. He has her brought to him, he seduces her, and in the Bible, when women get seduced, they always get pregnant. So she gets pregnant. So then he has this problem. Now think about this fact pattern, because we're going to see it again and again. Then he has this problem because he discovers the woman is the wife of one of his best generals, Uriah. So this is a big, big problem for him. So then he does what every other leader in this situation does, engages in the cover-up. Okay, how am I going to cover this up? Simple. I call Uriah. He comes back from the front. We give him a little wine. He sleeps with his wife. Problem solved. And here's what's fascinating in terms of a leadership story. The details of this story are wonderful. Uriah comes back and he makes this amazing statement. How can I get drunk and sleep with my wife when my men are out at the front fighting? Ooh. If that isn't a little dig on what leaders should be doing, I don't know what is. So then David has a bigger problem. Again, think about this fact pattern. The cover-up has to escalate, doesn't it? So then what he does is he arranges for Uriah to be sent to the front, and then he tells another general to have his men withdraw, and Uriah is killed. Now, there's a couple of things of this story that we see again and again in scandals with leaders. First of all, the biggest problem, the biggest abuse of power among leaders when they get in trouble is in the cover-up. Killing Uriah is a lot worse than seducing Bathsheba. And if you're thinking about some similar story in recent history, I can perfectly understand it. And I mean, it's fascinating to look at the parallels with Bill Clinton, isn't it? Because lying to the public in a lot of people's minds was a lot worse than philandering with an intern. Though maybe not for everybody, but for a lot of people. Cover-ups usually are where leaders most abuse their power. But there's other lessons in this story. David had been extremely successful up to this point. And so what is he doing? Well, he's not paying attention to his business. There's a metaphor in here. He's literally not looking at what he should be looking at. He should be paying attention to the men on the front, and he's looking at a woman bathing. Leaders, when they're successful, often lose strategic focus. Where was his strategic focus? Well, he doesn't have strategic focus. The other things that happen, certainly leaders have access to all sorts of resources, and when they're very successful, they believe that they can control outcomes. And we've seen this in our own political system. I mean, I still laugh when I think about Gary Hart years ago. For the students in here who may not remember this incident, Gary Hart was running for president, and people said he was having affairs with other women, and he said, if you think I'm having affairs with other women, follow me. They followed him, and he was having an affair with another woman. But we see leaders do this again and again. It's a fascinating pathology. I mean, it's not just now, but if you think about the Old Testament, we're talking about people doing this for very long periods of time. And so there is this belief that when you're successful, you'll continue to be able to control outcomes. You can lie to people, you can do all sorts of things possible. Now, the other interesting aspect of this story is the whistleblower. There's a whistleblower in this story, and he's a prophet named Nathan. And Nathan knows what the king did. And so the cover-up isn't that successful. And Nathan, it's very clever how Nathan confronts King David. He goes up to him and he says, instead of saying, you know, I know what you did, etc., he goes up and he says, I want to tell you a story. There's this man who has a sheep, and he loves his sheep. It's the only sheep he has, and he really loves it. He takes good care of it. And he lives in the same area as a man who has thousands of sheep. And this man decides to have a banquet, and he takes this other man's sheep, and he slaughters it for his banquet. And King David gets very angry and says, who is this man? I'll punish him. That's a horrible thing to do. And Nathan says, this man is you. And it's a fascinating little twist, because very often, I think what's interesting about the warped wood of humanity is that people don't do wrong because they don't know that they're doing wrong. They do wrong because they lose sight of what's right and what's wrong. And this is certainly the case. And then, as we know, literally in the Bible, all hell does usually break loose. And David gets punished, but he still gets to be king, and he still goes on and has his son, who becomes Solomon. They lose the baby, but, you know, he's punished. So it's an interesting story to think that there were people, no matter what your religion, that there were people back in these times telling a story like this about a leader. And that's why I think ancient texts tell us something about our psyche as human beings, and tell us something about the patterns of what happens to human beings when they get themselves into positions of power. Now, it's also interesting to look at, we usually study all the unethical things leaders do, but there's another kind of danger leaders fall into, and that is they get into a state of what I call blinding self-righteousness. Leaders are dangerous when they do things that are bad or wrong, but they're also dangerous when they think they're really, really right, and more morally right than everyone else. So I want to tell you another little story about an explorer named Magellan. And Magellan was an extraordinary navigator. He was a Portuguese sailor who went to the King and Queen of Spain and asked them essentially for venture capital because he had a big idea. And his big idea was he really thought that the Rio River went all the way across South America. So he had this nice shortcut to get to the east. And so the King and Queen of Spain bankrolled him. The Spanish sailors were all very mad because that was venture capital they weren't getting for their journeys. And he ended up with a ragtag crew of people and a few nobles on his boat to spy on him. One named Antonio Pigafetta, who was an Italian nobleman who wrote this whole story up, so we actually have a log of this. Anyway, so off Magellan goes, and of course they get up to the Rio River, and it's not going across South America. You wouldn't want to be on that boat when you hit the dead end, right? You've been at sea on these tiny little wooden boats. So then Magellan, I mean, in terms of leadership, this is an extraordinary thing. So he convinces them to come back out, and they took the long journey down the Tierra del Fuego, which is about the worst place in the world you want to be on the ocean, all the way up around South America, and he lands in the Philippines. It's 12,000 miles in a little wooden boat. It's an extraordinary navigational feat. He gets to the Philippines, and Magellan decides he's got a new job now. He's done the navigation thing, new job. He's going to convert everyone in the Philippines to Christianity. And he goes at it with the same fervor he goes at everything. And one day, he's praying over one of the converted chief's sons, and the son gets better. And so then Magellan starts thinking he can cure people by praying. Meanwhile, his men think he's crazy. Then what he does is he decides, I've got to really beef up this conversion thing, so I'm going to put on a demonstration. And you know how the Philippines are tons of little islands. And he said, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to show the superiority of Christianity by fighting this chief's heathen enemy. And I'm going to do it in front of everyone so they can see how superior the Christians are to the heathens. So he stages a battle. I mean, it's a rather extraordinary thing to do, but he stages this amazing battle. And none of his men want to go to this battle because they think it's kind of stupid. So he ends up going with cooks and stewards and other people who don't know how to fight battles very well. And the battle plan's very simple. He's going to take these little boats, and they're going to go up to the island, and the enemy will be waiting on the island. And then they're going to bring in the big guns and the big boats, and they're just going to blast everybody to pieces. And then they'll show the superiority to everyone else. It's a good plan. So Magellan goes off in his boat. They get to the island. He's about knee-deep in water. He looks around. No boats. Magellan was struck down knee-deep in water in his armor because he forgot to ask about the tides. And it's an interesting little story to think about, that the greatest navigator in the world would forget about the tides. But sometimes it's fascinating to look at leaders who believe that they're so right that they forget what they've learned about other things. The historian William Manchester writes of this. He says, "Now, in late April of 1521, on the eve of this wholly unnecessary battle, Magellan was everything he had never been. He had never before been reckless, impudent, careless, or forgetful of the tactical lessons he had learned during Portuguese operations in East Africa, India, Morocco, and Malaya. But then again, he had not been a soldier of Christ." So the interesting little story here is that a lot of things about being in a leadership role are extraordinary from a moral point of view. Not just simply the pressures, not just simply power, but the dynamics and interaction of a variety of things that go on. My colleague Terry Price has written a book on the moral mistakes of leaders, and one of the things he argues is that leaders often think they're not subject to the same rules as everyone else, that they can skirt around procedures and policies and everything else, in part because of the way we treat them. We give leaders special privileges. And this relates to a lot of issues in our society today. For example, executive compensation, a very big ethical issue in business today. When you start giving people extra privileges, they start to believe they are exceptions to the rest of the rules. So a Dennis Kozłowski, if we go back to the Tycho scandal, he doesn't think he needs to pay taxes on his paintings because he can have them shipped to his office. Well, he's an exception to the rule, isn't he? And this, I think, is one of the more interesting pathologies of leaders and one of the more interesting dangers of leaders. Also in nonprofit organizations, often people think that they're doing great work, they're doing charitable work, you're running a soup kitchen, so your staff doesn't need to wear those hairnets and plastic gloves that everyone else has to wear in restaurant kitchens because you're doing good stuff for other people. So there's a very interesting danger in leaders who think that they have too much morality, because too much morality allows for excuses, again, for not following the rules. I want to finish up with a couple thoughts about why, we're about to enter into a campaign season where people are going to be looking very closely at the ethics of political candidates, trying to figure out who's going to be good and who's going to be bad. And of course, democracy was supposed to be a corrective for bad leaders. It was put in place with the idea you could get rid of the bad ones, you could pick the ones you wanted, you could have a say in the process. But sometimes democracy doesn't work too well, as we well know, because there's always the paradox of all of these people running have the paradox of being ethical as candidates and ethical as leaders. And you can't be an ethical leader unless you can get to be the leader yourself. This problem is magnified if you look in developing countries and developing democracies where you have the problem of corrupt political systems and you can't bring in a reformer because the way in which the reformer's enemies combat them is through what I call ethical battering of each other. So we have a lot of, I think, complicated elements to our own system of choosing leaders. We want people who know how to do the job well. We want people who are ethical. And we want people who are going to be ethical both on the campaign trail and when they actually get in office. And the interesting question is always, well, can you make that split? If you're unethical on the campaign trail, can you be ethical in office? The other paradox we have when we look at leaders and we're trying to decide who to choose and what to do with them is that if you look at the full range of morality in a person, we usually look for people to do the right thing the right way for the right reason. And what we discover in leaders, because their actions are so public, is sometimes they only get 2 out of 3. They may do the right thing for the right reason, but the wrong way. Or they may do it the right way, but for the wrong reason. It's very hard to get that alignment of all 3, and yet the public wants them, and it leads to very confusing public debates. And the last big public debate that dealt with these 3 issues was the debate about going into Iraq. Was it the right thing to do? Was going to war the right way to do it? And what was the reason for doing it? These are very, very interesting elements of morality that the public constantly struggles with when we look at what leaders do and how to make judgments about them. So with that, I'm going to stop and hear some of your thoughts and questions, and I can just call on people. Okay, thank you. There's always that pause. Okay.
If you were going to stand there, Dr. Ciulla, and say to us, here's a checklist of ethical leadership, can you do that?
Did you hear that? If I were to stand here and give you a checklist of ethical leadership, could I do that? Yes and no. I mean, I could give some general precepts, but I think, anybody who studies leadership realizes that there are 2 aspects of it. I mean, there is what people are like in terms of character and the habits that they bring to the job, and then there is also the context of the job itself. And we do need different leaders in different kinds of contexts. So that part will be difficult. But for the most part, if we were to put up a job description of a leader, here's a couple things that wouldn't be in the job description. I'll answer it in a Popperian answer, as it were. What wouldn't be in the job description is wanted a leader who will favor his or her friends and relatives before everyone else. So one of the things leaders have to do is they have to have a wide domain of people who are included in the goods that they help to provide. So, and that's really distinctive because they have moral obligations to strangers, and someone who understands how to do that, that's really important. Leaders need to look after the greater good. There's something inherently utilitarian about leadership. That's why we put people in office, to look after the greatest good. Leaders need to have self-discipline. They need perspective on who they are. And one of the ways, this Bathsheba story, there's something called the Bathsheba syndrome. And one way to fight the Bathsheba syndrome is to have people who, not only checks and balances in the system, but people who, as Aristotle said, to have good friends. Leaders need to have good friends. Now that sounds like cronyism and everything bad. But what he means by that is they need to have people around them who can say, are you out of your mind doing this? And they need to be willing to listen to those people. Leaders who surround themselves with yes people are extremely dangerous leaders. And because, again, they're assuming that they're perfect when they're not. And that's my most important one, is leaders need to understand that they're not perfect and that they need the help of other people. And especially in today's complex organizations and world, one person cannot do this job or be right all the time. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on Jack Welch and MacArthur as examples?
Comment on Jack Welch and MacArthur as examples of leaders? Well, I'm in business ethics too, and business ethicists are not thrilled with Jack Welch. He had a lot of problems. As a matter of fact, if you look at his business, there were several ethical problems in his businesses because often he made the mistake, I think, of at times saying, I don't care how you get the results, which is a recipe for unethical behavior. MacArthur, I have in one of my books something called the Sicilian slapping incident of MacArthur. Do you remember that? Oh, it was a famous incident which showed the mixed bag of MacArthur, because I'm not an expert on MacArthur, but he was a mixed bag. Here was a leader who was well respected, good in military, and he was in Sicily in the hospitals, And there was several men who weren't wounded but had post-traumatic stress syndrome. And he thought they were just being lazy and cowardly and slapped a few of them. Well, this made the big newspapers. And it's an interesting example of the fact that no leader is perfect and is going to have that level of perfection. And there's going to be flaws all the way down. So when people complain, where are the great leaders today? Well, part of it is good news. We know more about our leaders, so we know they're human. I mean, did you know there's even a negative book on Mother Teresa? I know you think that's hard to imagine. But she ran a huge organization, so there were things to criticize in a huge organization. Her hospitals, for example, a lot of them didn't provide sort of the right level of medical care in terms of sanitary conditions and all of these other things. So leaders are mixed bags, and I think it's probably the kiss of death. I was at the Harvard Business School when they were making a saint out of Jack Welch, and he was a very good PR guy. But he was somebody judged. He's a great example because he was mostly judged by effectiveness. And then they discovered there was some manipulation of the way that stock price looked. No company has a perfectly even stock price unless somebody's shaping it in questionable ways. Yes, ma'am.
Do you see a difference between female leadership and male leadership?
I'd like to say women are just much better and more ethical and smarter and everything else. I can't say that, but here's what I can say. If you look at a lot of the recent research and theories on leaders in today's world that involves, for example, a lot of networks, a lot of sort of connecting with people that you don't necessarily see, a better educated workforce, women do tend to have many of those traits that work better with those groups, because one of the biggest changes when we look at the American workforce is the level of education. You simply can't manage college graduate workers in the same way you manage people during the Industrial Revolution. So they do tend to have those traits, but here's where the research is clear. When women run all female organizations, they lead differently than men. When women run mixed organizations, they don't find a whole lot of difference between leadership, and then they're very much influenced by the culture, because ironically they wouldn't get to lead in that organization if they didn't do something that already fit with the culture. So, but aside, just between you and me, we're smarter and better. Yes, sir.
I'm intrigued by the British system of having a no confidence vote when a leader seems to lose direction and they can be displaced before the end of their term.
Mm-hmm.
Has it ever been considered in the United States?
Not that I know of. Oh, yeah, the British have a system where they can give a no confidence vote of their leaders. And the question was, have we ever considered that in the United States? I think this might be a good place to start. I wish we could do it down the line. Because it is another level of accountability that would be, and it's public, it's very transparent. Our system isn't as transparent as theirs. I mean, our president doesn't have to stand up to the parliament and take questions all the time. Yeah, great idea. Sir, in the back?
What are your thoughts on the statement that business ethics is an oxymoron?
My comments on the statement that business ethics is an oxymoron. Well, going back to Transparency International, what we partly discover is that an awful lot of countries that don't have ethics don't have much business either. So it's not a contradiction in terms of, if you look at a lot of corruption in countries, they are barriers to entry to market. They cause governments to pay more money for goods and services. So it's not as much a contradiction in terms, especially in today's world where very often you're doing business with people you don't see. Trust is a currency that is extremely powerful in business. It's extremely powerful in politics. And without trust, it becomes very difficult to do business. And lastly, because of the amount of information we can get about people and businesses these days, it's very hard to keep secrets. So an unethical business is not going to be a very sustainable business. So I really don't think it's a contradiction in terms, and you probably don't either. You're just giving me a hard time. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They're located in Germany, and they include a variety of constituencies. The World Bank feeds into them, The Economist feeds into them in terms of collecting data, and then there are surveys, and I think they have 7 instruments they use. And if you go to the website, they explain their methodology for how they collect this data. And one of the things they emphasize is that people shouldn't take the data as, sort of the law on these countries, because a lot of countries get their scores and then really sort of think about what they need to work on. And the World Bank had a mixed record on how they've treated. I mean, I've been working with the World Bank for the past year because they've decided they need a lot more variables to look at, and one of the variables they're looking at right now is trying to figure out ways to educate leaders to not be corrupt. And this gets back to ethics and effectiveness. I mean, what's ironic in the world today is a lot of leaders. I was talking to a man named Shisango, who was the former president of Mozambique, and he said, I was a rebel leader and then I became president of the country. I didn't know how to do anything. And very often, if you look at transitional societies, you discover there's a lot of people who just don't know how to do it. And so a lot of unethical behavior comes from the fact that they simply don't have the competency to be effective. And so the World Bank and other agencies are trying to sort of look at this as only one variable on the transparency index, and then start thinking more about the people element of how do you, for example, they've got some mentoring programs where finance ministers, retired finance ministers, work with new finance ministers in developing countries. And I think that's very promising in terms of trying to develop better leadership. Yes, in the back there.
Hi, thanks very much. I actually wanted to follow up on Claudia's point a little bit. I want to put this in as friendly a way that I'm still looking for a thesis.
A thesis.
The topic of the talk was, I think, the nature of leadership, right? And Claudia asked, what basically she's asking, all right, what is the mace would be removed? And I mean, you tried out a couple of answers to that. One was to appeal to something Aristotelian about not helping friends. Now, I guess there is a view out there that says that depending on who your friends are, that's actually exactly who you're supposed to help. For instance, it turns out that maximizing corporate power actually does maximize net happiness in the long run, like various libertarian conservatives seem to think. Right? So it's not a necessary truth, right? That's not the nature of good leadership to not help friends. And then you said something that then you went to a different sort of move, which was to say that, all right, well, you should be thinking about everyone. You should be maximizing net utility or thinking for the good of all or something like that. But then I'm thinking that that can't quite be right either, because typically if you're talking about a leader, unless you're talking about a leader of everybody, everything, then you're actually obligated to help those around you. The American president is supposed to help us, at least us first. In addition,
Right.
We can help everybody else too, and that's great. But that's what we elected to do, and it seems like that's what a good leader would have as the virtue.
Right.
So it can't always be helping everyone. Now, for you and me, we're not president or anything like that. Maybe that is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to act in the common self or common interest and all the rest. But so then it can't quite be, helping everyone. So then I'm still looking for a thesis about what the nature of good leadership is. Could you add something more to what?
Sure. Well, and the helping everyone is not taken so large. Howard Gardner, who writes on leadership, one of the things he notices when he looks at historical figures in leadership is he notices that some of the best leaders are leaders who do not exclude people from their domain. So it depends on what domain they're in. So he uses Margaret Thatcher as an example, and he says, she was a great leader in certain respects, but one of the things that was interesting was while she was leading, there were a lot of people left out in her own country in the domain of people that she was concerned with. So that's one way. And of course, you're asking a classic problem that Mill addresses in the beginning of utilitarianism, and that is, he says one challenge to utilitarianism is that, not everybody's thinking about the greatest good, and I would probably answer you in the same way Mill would, and that would be that it has to be relative to whatever context is there. But what is the thesis? The thesis goes back, it is an Aristotelian thesis. The thesis is that ethics is inseparable from effectiveness. So the notion of arete, or virtue, is, as Aristotle and Plato both talk about it, the idea that doing something well is connected to being virtuous. And in a lot of my other works, I actually play this out in a lot more detail. But in our own society, we've made this fake split between ethics and effectiveness, which causes all sorts of problems. And I would say it's a kind of problem in modernity that, we decide that your morality is one thing. I mean, even the way we talk about it, people talk about their personal morality and their public morality, which at least to me as a philosopher, doesn't make sense, because morality is about how you relate to other people. But the thesis is that ethics is inseparable from effectiveness. The second part of what I've been trying to say is that if you look at ethics and leadership, what is morally distinctive about being in a leadership role? What are some of the interesting challenges of it? So that's the second part. The intent was not to talk about all the necessary and sufficient conditions for what makes somebody a good leader, but rather to say there are these inherent tensions when you're in a leadership position that I think are morally unique. The reason why I make that move philosophically is that if you're going to have a field called leadership ethics, if you're going to develop that kind of field, you have to sort of map out what the issues are that are distinctive to that. Just as in medical ethics, we map out what those issues are, in business ethics, we map them out. So part of what you're hearing are fragments of how I've begun to map out what is ethically challenging, what is ethically distinctive. I think moral obligations to strangers is distinctive because you still don't know every single person in your constituency. You may have first responsibility for that constituency, but I think you would agree, maybe you wouldn't, that leaders don't just look at their own constituencies. It can't be, well, I'm going to take care of my people, and then who cares about anything else, or the environment, or anything else. So I think that this ability, and it relates to how you teach leadership. I mean, when we designed our school, one of the things we said was that leadership really rests on, first of all, perspective. One of the things that makes leaders different than managers is this idea of the whole. Who is in the constituency? What are the obligations, and what are the long-range elements of what I do? Managers often look at how you just work through the system. So I think that's really important. People, they have a very different kind of relationship to people in that there's power